Manaus, in the heart of the Amazon basin, had opera houses in 1900. And then when the rubber plants were taken to Kew Gardens in London, and then from there to Malaysia, and within 30, 40 years, all world rubber production was happening on the Malaysian plantations. This subject goes on and on and on, but what I've told you are the guts of it. The producing of commodities, the establishment of colonies, endless wars to expand territory followed. The War of Jenkins there. The West Indian Islands were trading. The French were taking the English islands. The English were taking the French islands. The 7 Years' War over the North American colonies, which spilled into the West Indies. All these historical events impacted our world, and we were a part of it. Not a great part of it, but our commodities were Brazalito wood in the beginning, and then forest products. Our colonists desperately questing for anything that they could export to England or sell to passing ships. Turtles, monk seal oil, which drove our monk seal population to extinction so thoroughly that our people don't even have monk seals in our cultural memory. Whales, ash, people don't know, but we burned whole huge areas of forest and sent the ash in hogs' head barrels to England to make soap and for fertilizer. All these things shaped our world, and whether you pass judgment or not, great wealth was accumulated. The English sugar producers became one of the richest and most powerful sets of people in this mercantilist world in history. For 200 years they controlled Parliament in England. But there were always good people, Wilberforce, the tremendous drive to stop the slave trade and so forth. I don't know how to put an epitaph on it all, but the wealth that came from these commodity exchanges within the New World. The salt cod of New England gave New England the capital and food and timber that was being sold to the West Indies to create their merchant class, which in turn fermented and led the American Revolution and led to the establishment of the United States of America. In the end, you think of all the great wealth that accumulated in the British Empire. Empires nowadays are thought of as oppressive and dirty things. In my cultural ancestry, empire, even if the emperor at the heart was a cruel and evil man, but when barbarians were invading and the frontiers were going up in flames and you were next, you were praying for the imperial army to show up and protect you. And when the Avars and the Persians turned on Constantinople in 618, 623, it was the province of North Africa that saved the Byzantine Empire. So it wasn't all bad. You think about the tremendous cost of World War II to England. I think it was just last year that England finished paying for World War II. There's a great book about it called The Audit of War. And so one way or another, the wealth that came from all that suffering and all that exploitation, but also all that building and all this new world, in the end, helped us all. it always ends anticlimactically, because really this is a subject which needs to be broken up into a series of lectures. But I'd like you to treat this as an introduction to the subject, not your last. It's so easy to study and read now. There are wonderful books written about it. I was privileged to have to study the history of the British Empire and Commonwealth for A-level. And then the last few years with the Rum Festival, my sister has made me lecture against the din of music on rum and sugar and so forth. If you come again this February, you can come and hear more details. But all these things work together. The commodities of the New World, I haven't mentioned tobacco. People might wonder why we didn't produce grapes and olives. We weren't let. The Old World mother countries didn't want us to produce everything that could compete with them. And part of what's gone wrong with the Old World is that the New World and the colonial world are now doing everything themselves. Manufacturing, once India was the colony that took all the manufactured clothes from the English textile industries. Now it's coming back the other way and so forth. A dreary subject, but if you don't know it, you don't really understand our history, and that's my message tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have
any discussion you want?
questions?
I'll try. Yes, sir.
So I thought you were going to talk a bit about the fact that the Spanish started growing sugar in Florida and wanted labor, and therefore West African slaves were sent over, some from the Bahamas, I believe, because when the other thing is you didn't mention is the loyalists who were forced out of the American colonies and came to the Bahamas, and they needed slaves too.
Sure.
How did that all fit into this
The
picture?
loyalists, the slave trade was still on at the time of the loyalist migration, but how much of it actually happened in terms of new transportation, I don't know. I believe
in the Loyalist period,
Lord.
in the Loyalist period, there were 9,000, nearly 10,000 slaves between 1787 and 1787 and 1806.
They were brought to the Bahamas.
Brought to the Bahamas.
Yes, but
in the
they
Loyalist.
largely came from the North American plantations. The British had taken Florida in the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War, 1763, and held Florida. So there were actually 14 colonies. They held it until the treaty at the end of the American Revolution.
1783.
Yes, and then it went back to Spain. The loyalists who had, a lot of them went, more loyalists went to Lower and Upper Canada, to Nova Scotia, than came here. But the ones who came here were being amassed, and were going to really strengthen the Florida colony. And then suddenly it went back to Spain, and they were not going to stay under Spain, and so forth. And hence our colonial history. But it was still part of the momentum. And the British thought that nobody did EIAs, nobody studied agricultural science, and the islands were largely underpopulated. They didn't understand that slavery was not really economical in the Bahamas, because you couldn't grow commodity crops sustainably for any long distance. If you really want to know more about it, there's a wonderful chapter of a 4-volume travel log called A Journey Through the Confederation by a German, a Hessian German surgeon in the British Army during the Revolutionary War. And he actually came, I can't remember his name.
Sure.
S-C-H something.
O-E-P-H.
Yes, Dr. Yes, I can email his article, his Bahama chapter, to whoever wants it. He came on one of the first convoys bringing loyalists to Crown Haven, Abaco, Carlton, Egg Island off Spanish Wells, and that's the only way we know what Egg Island was called Egg Island for, the boobies, which are extinct there now, and then New Providence. And there were blacks on board who were doing rake and scrape. If you want to know cultural musical history, he actually describes the saw and the rake and scrape African dance music that was played on the boats. And he went to Rose Island, and he wrote a very detailed account at the time. And the slavery he described, this is now before the Loyalists, this is when the demographics were 1-to-1. He described it as a Bermuda-style slavery. And the Bermuda-style slavery, but Bermuda was in a unique position because they were fantastic boat builders and seamen. And they would build boats in Bermuda after they cleaned out their own forests from Bahama forests and North American forest timber. They would go up and get codfish, cornmeal, commodities, run through the Bahamas, always sheltered, and we were always part of it. And then trade and come back with sugar and rum. And the Bermudians would send the whole ship with a slave captain and a slave crew. So they must have been well treated enough, or the families were hostage. Sometimes they would then sell the boat and ship home, and then they would all build another boat and they would go again. So, and here he described the slaves being sent out into the forest to saw 6 types of mahogany. And he mentions horseflesh mahogany, but we don't call horseflesh and mahogany. We have the Sweetana mahogany, the West Indian mahogany. But horseflesh is a beautiful dark wood. Wild tamarind, we think. Dogwood, maybe red cedar. Don't know what the 6th one was, but and the slaves went for weeks and months out, and then they came back with sawn timber, and they got a share, and the master got a share. As I said, the main slave trade and the main huge slave populations went to the sugar islands. And of course, in time, because sugar was so valuable, every inch of land was used for sugar, and they were totally dependent on the trade of food. And when the British blockaded New England and stopped the colonies from exporting, this alone would have 3,000 people die of starvation. And that's why when Captain Cook had reported breadfruit, there was so much interest to go get that and bring it to enrich the empire and feed and make the colonies self-sufficient. And that was a driving force. In Jamaica, the main botanical garden for the whole West Indies was the Royal Botanical Garden. And every kind of new fruit and new crop was taken there first, propagated, and then sent to the royal governors of everywhere. And we got our share of breadfruit. And the tragedy is that now that everybody's learning to eat it again, we're just finishing cutting down all the great breadfruit. So if you look at the variety that's left, some are round, some are long, some are sweet, some are... We got our full fair share of breadfruit trees. Okay.
Any more questions?
Call me if you need anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I bought a series of CDs. It's called The History of Us, and it goes right back to early times and comes through. Much as what you've spoken about is on these tapes. It's really good.
Yeah, I forgot to say one thing.
You have it?
Say one more thing. I forgot to tie back in the Jewish populations. Initially, there were some Jewish migrations as part of the Portuguese colonization, but they were never trusting the Roman Catholic Church and what might happen with inquisitions and so forth. The Dutch were so powerful and so bigoty, as we would say, that they actually militarily invaded and conquered the northeast part of Brazil and started growing sugar there. And there was a huge movement of Dutchmen, and amongst them Dutchmen of Jewish residency and descent. And then the Portuguese defeated them and expelled them. And Barbados had started with somewhat humble origins, and they were trying to grow tobacco. One of the first things they did was send a voyage to the Orinoco and to northern Brazil. And it came back with Indians who knew how to make moby and sugar cane. So they were introducing sugar cane to Barbados. We're talking about the 1620s, when the Portuguese expelled the Dutch. And there was a huge movement. Anybody of Jewish descent or Dutch Protestant descent that could get out of that part of Brazil, and a lot of ships, when they found out what had happened, diverted to Barbados. And the capital and the science that came with that movement of people helped to make Barbados into one of the richest of the little colonies at the time. I forgot to just fit that into the story.
And also
Jamaica got a huge share of Sephardic Jews. A lot of Jamaican plantation owners claim descent from that migration of people.
And you didn't mention that Jews came across with Columbus on his first journey.
Yeah. Okay.
Good. Well, Pericles, thanks so much. That was a wonderful world tour, new world tour and old world tour. I enjoyed it very much. I hope you all did too. We give him a round of applause, I think. Just a reminder again, on November the 16th, we're going to have Percy Vola Francis come and talk about the history of Junkanoo. So have a good evening, and thanks for coming out.